to another segment of Robert Capon's book, The Parables of Grace. Today we are looking at the chapter entitled The Hardest Parable, the Unjust Steward, from the Gospel of Luke, the 16th chapter, verses 1 to 13, and I would like to read that. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is it that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, my people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonored manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The parable of the unjust steward may well be the most difficult of all the parables of Jesus. This story, in which a business manager's crooked attempts to feather his bed after having been fired and first held up for admiration and then made the occasion of obviously critical comments, probably spooks more interpreters into false starts than any other. Let me list just a few of the devices, desperate and otherwise, that suggest themselves to me as I confront the parable's built-in contradictions. The first and worst is to try to make the whole problem go away by maintaining that Jesus never said these words. This approach, even though it is frequently used to get Jesus off the hook of teaching things his commentators find intellectually disreputable, has two fatal flaws. The first is that there's no way of proving Jesus didn't say something when the only source we have says he did. Aggressive critics, of course, can always claim they base their conclusions not on other sources, but on considerations of form criticism. But even for them, the unjust steward just sits there in the text stubbornly insisting that Jesus told it. The second flaw in this approach, however, is the really devastating one. If Jesus didn't say this, who did? You might possibly get away with assigning an item like his remarks about divorce or fornication to the hand of some second-century ecclesiastical morality maven, but the unjust steward? Derivative minds look like that cook up only derivative intellectual concoctions, bland and predictable. They do not produce wildly original dishes like this one. Admittedly, there is a variation on the Jesus didn't say it approach that is less silly, and that is, if you will, more or less inevitable with this parable. I call it the give Jesus credit for the words, but blame every other thing you can on somebody else. In the case of the unjust steward, it works nicely to separate the moralism of the epilogue to the parable from the obviously intended immorality of the parable itself. Here is how you put it in effect. In your mind's eye, you have Luke sit down at his gospel-writing desk the morning after he has finished the prodigal son, and you have him reach for the pack of index cards containing his so far unused notes on the final journey to Jerusalem. He slips the rubber band off, and what does he find? He finds a whole collection of moralistic bits and pieces about fidelity, covetousness, the law, divorce, scandal, forgiveness, faith, duty, and the coming of the kingdom, plus one miracle, the cleansing of the 10 lepers, and 4 parables, the unjust steward, the rich man and Lazarus, the unjust judge, and the Pharisees and the publican. How is he to hang all this together? Well, maybe the imagery of the big country house he's just used to in the prodigal son at the end of chapter 15 can be carried over into the beginning of chapter 16 by starting it off with the crooked major demo story. And then, let's see, since that material ends with a crack about unrighteous mammon, maybe he can tuck in some of these scraps about money and trustworthiness and stuff. And then, terrific, while he's on the subject, the rich man, poor beggar story will slide in nicely. But you see the point. He is making an author's decision, and as such choices go, he did remarkably well. His only mistake, probably, was hanging on to all those moral bits and pieces until this late in his gospel. They sound far more like the early Jesus, the wonder-working rabbi of the Sermon on the Mount, than like Jesus on his way to death and resurrection. And as a matter of fact, when Matthew looked at his pack of index cards, he decided that Jesus' warning against trying to serve both God and mammon should, in his own gospel, go precisely into the Sermon on the Mount. In any case, it all boils down to the fact that there are basically just 2 ways of interpreting this parable. You can make the steward out to be a hero, or you can make him out to be a villain. Obviously, if you decide to read the parable as verses 1 through 8, the white hat interpretation will be your natural choice. But if you read it as verses 1 through 13, the black hat will seem to fit better. It's worth noting, though, that each interpretation has a price to it. If you make the steward a bad guy, several things don't make sense. In the first place, the heavily moralized parable that gives you consists ill not only with the preceding parables in Luke, but with the entire tone of the final journey to Jerusalem. Jesus has been on a grace trip for 7 chapters now. He has been talking lastness, lostness, death, and resurrection, and he has again and again made it clear that the bookkeeping department's heyday is a thing of the past. Why then, at this stage of the game, would he poke in a parable that has none of the above as its main point, that amounts to little more than a Surgeon General's warning that shady dealings is hazardous to your soul's health? Above all, why on earth would he put into the parable verse 8, and the Lord praised the unjust steward because he acted shrewdly? A verse which, unless it is taken as pure sarcasm, makes no sense whatsoever if you take the steward as a plain old bounder. On the other hand, if you make the steward a good guy, verse 8 becomes the principal support for your interpretation, so much so that you are willing, as I am, to lop off the rest of the passage in order to do justice to its decisiveness. Even at that price, though, the steward as hero interpretation seems preferable. It is, as you will see, consonant with the whole thrust of the parables of grace in particular. It allows the parable to voice once again the theme of forgiveness by resurrection from the dead, that is the burden of so much of what Jesus has been saying. It even allows you to entertain the most bizarre and fruitful notion of all, namely that the unjust steward has Christ figured. But more of that shortly. Time now to expound the parable in order. It begins with some nameless informant telling a certain rich man that his steward has been wasting his money, his possessions. Score one fascinating point right there for a grace rather than a morality interpretation of this parable. Wasting is the same verb used in the prodigal son to describe the boy's wasting of his substance in the far country. From Jesus' very choice of words, therefore, we are given a hint of continuity. Next, the master, without any trial or even fair inquiry, simply reads the steward the riot act. What's this I hear? You're a disgrace? Turn in your books. You're fired. Score yet another point for continuity. Just as with the parable son, death enters this parable early and as a pivotal consideration. The son found himself dead in the far country. The steward comes out of his master's office with none of his old life left at all. But at this point, the parable of the unjust steward diverges from the prodigal son and begins to look more like an upside-down version of the unforgiving servant. Watch. So the steward said to himself, "What shall I do now that my master has taken away my managership? I am not strong enough to work as a laborer. I am too proud to be a beggar. Ah, I've got it. I will use my brains and ace out that unforgiving tyrant. So he wants to play letter of the law games, does he? He would like me to turn in my books, eh? Well, I'll do just that after I've made a few adjustments." What he does, of course, is call in his master's debtors and settle accounts with them at considerable write-offs. He knocks the bill of one of them down by half, the bill of another by a fifth, all of which might produce a number of different results, depending on how you estimate it. On the one hand, it might at one and the same time make him look bad to his master and good to the debtors. If the master ever remembers any of the originally owned amounts he could be so furious over being gypped that the presence of cash in the till would hardly be enough to modify him. But then, if the debtors thought kindly of the steward's write-offs, they might, as he hoped, receive him into their houses after he was officially fired. On the other hand, his sharp dealing could, with even more logic, be read as making him look good to his master and bad to the debtors. For all we know, the master may have been overjoyed to get even 50 cents on the dollar from the deadbeats like these. Likewise, for all we know, deadbeats like those could very likely have spotted the steward as no better than themselves and refused to give him office space. But whichever of those readings or combination of them you decide to go with, the deciding factor remains verse 8. "And the Lord praised the unjust steward, for the children of this age are wiser in their generation than the children of light." Somehow, between verse 2, "What's this, you're fired?" and verse 8, "My beamish boy, you're a genius," I never thought I'd see even a nickel from those accounts. The master of the steward has turned from the unforgiving bookkeeper to a happy-go-lucky celebrator of any new interest that comes along. And what has happened to him can, as I have said, be best understood by comparing this parable with that of the unforgiving servant. In that parable, forgiveness starts from the top down. The Lord, who is owed $10 million by one of his servants, simply drops dead to his own claim and absolves the debt. His intention, of course, is that the servant will take the hint and likewise drop dead to the $100 owed to him by a fellow servant. But as Jesus tells the story, things do not work out that way. The forgiven servant chooses a bookkeeper's life rather than a spendthrift's death, and thus short-circuits the working of forgiveness. Still, the point of the parable remains unchanged. Grace works only on those it finds dead enough to raise. Exactly the same point is made in the parable of the unjust steward, but by a reversal of the story's device. Forgiveness in this parable starts from the bottom up. Here it is the Lord of the steward who starts out unwilling to drop dead to any of his bookkeeping. He will not die to the accounts past due that he has never succeeded in collecting. The steward, however, does die, and because he is freed by his death to think things he could not have thought before, he is the one who from the bottom of the heap, as it were, becomes the agent of life for everybody in the parable. He becomes life from the dead for his Lord, because somehow the sight of a loser bringing off a coup like this in the very thick of his losses finally loosens the old boy up. My God, the master says, my whole life has been a joke, and only now I learn to laugh at it. But the steward is also able to be the resurrection of his Lord's debtors, because they wouldn't consent to deal with anyone but a crook like themselves. They would never have gone near him if they hadn't been convinced he was dead to all the laws of respectable bookkeeping. As far as I'm concerned, therefore, the unjust steward is nothing less than the Christ figure in this parable, a dead ringer for Jesus himself. First of all, he dies and rises, like Jesus. Second, by his death and resurrection, he raises others, like Jesus. But third, and most important of all, the unjust steward is the Christ figure because he is a crook, like Jesus. The unique contribution of this parable to our understanding of Jesus is its insistence that grace cannot come to the world through respectability. Respectability regards only life, success, winning. It will have no truck with the grace that works by death and losing, which the only kind of grace there is. This parable, therefore, says in story form what Jesus himself said by his life. He was not respectable. He broke the Sabbath, he consorted with crooks, and he died as a criminal. Now, at last, in the light of this parable, we see why he refused to be respectable. He did it to catch a world that respectability could only terrify and condemn. He became sin for us sinners, weak for us weaklings, lost for us losers, and dead for us dead. St. Augustine said, "The cross is the devil's mousetrap, baited with Jesus' disreputable death. And it is a mousetrap for us too. Jesus baits us criminals with his own criminality. As the shabby debtors in the parable were willing to deal only with the crooked steward and not with the upright Lord, so we find ourselves drawn by the bait of a Jesus who winks at iniquity and makes friends with sinners, of us, crooks, that is, and of all the losers who would never in a million years go near a God who knew what was expected of himself and insisted on what he expected of others. You don't like that? You think it lowers standards and threatens good order? You bet it does. And if you will cast your mind back, you will recall that is exactly why the forces of righteousness got rid of Jesus. Unfortunately, though, the church has never been able for very long to leave Jesus looking like the attractively crummy character he is. It can hardly resist the temptation to gussy him up into a respectable citizen. Even more unfortunately, it can almost never resist the temptation to gussy itself up into a bunch of supposedly perfect peaches, too good for the riffraff to sink their teeth into. But for all that, Jesus remains the only real peach, too fuzzy on the outside, nowhere near as sweet as we expected on the inside, and with the jaw-breaking stone of his death right smack in the middle. And therefore he is the only mediator and advocate the likes of us will ever be able to trust, because like the unjust steward, he is no less a loser than we are, and like the steward, he is the only one who has even a chance of getting the Lord God to give us a kind word. Amen. Have a great Thanksgiving.